Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, friends. It's a pleasure to be here in this very interesting panel that is called Strategic Outlook of Latin America. And we have the pleasure of having three representatives of three key governments of the region. We have Mexico with Graciela Marquez, she's the Minister of Economy. We have Paulo Guedes from Brazil, he's the Minister of Finance, welcome. And we have Mr. Guillermo Nielsen, he's the head of IPF, which is Yacimientos Petrolíferos Fiscales of Argentina. And of course, my friend, Angel Gurria from OECD. So right away, let's start with this panel in which I think we have many issues to cover, and I will ask the panelists to take a first 5 minutes, and then we can have some questions from the public, and then we come back to the panelists. I think this is the way it will be most interactive. So first of all, let me just introduce a little bit about what's happening in our region. In 2019, 8 countries of the region changed leaders. We have 8 new governments in the region. And it was a very historic year of unrest, social unrest, basically, and social discontent. We have simultaneous slowdown growth. Almost 18 of the 20 countries of the region were decelerating, and the impact of the trade tensions between the US and China have affected very much our region because we have a very, I would say, weaker domestic demand with more fragile financial markets. So no question that at the heart of the discontent lies inequality, which is one of the main topics of this World Economic Forum. And of course, we have to say that we in the region have made a lot of progress in terms of combating poverty, no question. But it's not the same as combating inequality, which is, at the end of the day, something that is really hurting our economies. And basically more because there is a high risk of informality. We have 36.6%. Probably Angel will tell us a little bit more about it. But, and this is very close to the heart of Brazil, 44% of active persons in the middle income strata are not affiliated or contributing to the pension system. And the pension reforms are at the heart of what I think Brazil is trying to do. So with this very brief introduction, and I would say that to end, I would say that prospects are not very good because last year the region grew only 0.2%. This year the prospect is 1.3%. If we continue with this very low and downturn in the trends of growth, we are going to be 7 years between 2014 and 2020 will be the lowest economic growth in the recent history. So are we facing a lost decade again? What are we going to do, and what are the things that we can highlight? 3 countries that have newly appointed governments with different strategies. We have 3 different approaches in Latin America sitting around this panel. So let me quickly start by alphabetical order with Argentina. So, so anybody can be heard. I don't want to hurt anybody, just in case. So let me start with you, Guillermo, if you can tell us, how do you see things? How is the newly appointed government of Alberto Fernandez is facing probably one of the most difficult challenges, which is the debt sustainability?
Well, there are more than that. More than that.
Yeah, of course.
I agree with you. And let me start from your introduction, because it's true, Argentina has contributed to, through its stagnation, to this problem of the lost decade, alluding at the past decade. So our national challenge and the challenge of the government of Alberto Fernandez is really to detach from that lost decade and to make Argentina a contributor so that in some years from now, when we get together again, we will have a stronger Latin America with a large contribution of Argentina to that. And Argentina has the resources to do that. But it's true, Inauguration in Argentina is on December the 10th. So, coming to Davos for us is, we are just starting the government. So it's a sort of one step right after the Christmas break, in a way. So we have to deal with the highest inflation. Last year was the highest inflation in 28 years. We had, under the previous government regime, more than 300% of inflation, which is, a major problem, and it's a very difficult issue for South American economies. Luckily, most of the economies have overcome that problem, but it's not the case of Argentina. So it's a daunting problem that we have. We are coming from growth going down for 3%, and unemployment, which normally in Argentina is relatively low, is at the verge of 10%, which is, only in 2 years in the past 2001, around the 2001 crisis, we did over 10% unemployment. Unemployment is very high. Hunger is a problem, is one of the driving ideas of the government to end with hunger in a country that produces both vegetable protein and animal protein as to feed 400 million people. So it's crazy. I mean, it shows how the economy is not working well. So I would say, what are the two, starting to talk about what's going on now and about the future. The two main challenges we have this year in terms of policy making is really, on the one hand, the debt restructuring, and on the other hand, the launching of the growth path for the Argentine economy. So I'm going to try to tackle both of them. I was in charge of the restructuring of the debt as a result of the crisis of 2001. So we ended up with an exchange in 2005. Angel Gurria knows this very well. He worked on the other side. He was at the time on the other side negotiating on behalf of the German-speaking bondholders, I would say. So that leads me to one of the differences. Let's compare a bit what happened then and what's going on now. One of the differences is that in 2002, 2005, we had to deal with retail investors in Japan, especially in Italy, which was a major conflict that, went over and tainted relationships with the G7, for example. And in Germany, Austria, and part of Switzerland, which Angel Gurria took care of at that time. So this was a major problem, dealing with retail investors. Well, that's not the case now. Nowadays, what we have is that the debt is in the hands of professionals, both of real money professionals and of funds. So this is a very important difference at the time of trying to really straighten up the situation that we have in our hands right now. The second two economic aspects that I should underline here is that we have a situation of local law peso debt that is unprecedented. We have a level of peso debt that is really extremely high, and that's started to be dealt with at the end of the previous government, because the different debt was coming due, so they had to deal with that, and that never happened before in Argentina. Having such a level of debt in pesos is something absolutely new and requires a new thing. And the complexity of globalization is such that you don't only have local investors, but you have major players that came to Argentina to lend in pesos. So that adds complication to the situation as it is now. The other and the most complex situation is the debt we have with the IMF. Yeah. The IMF really did an incredible thing, in the sense that they went over their own rules for lending. They made exceptions for exceptional treatment of lending. So, overall, one of the first things that Alberto Fernandez did was to stop this train and saying, no more, we are taking no more debt from the IMF. But nevertheless, we have something like $44 billion debt with the IMF. In a government that increased debt for slightly above $100 billion over 4 years. So it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. We cannot believe that we are here with, 100 more billions of debt, and we don't have a gas pipeline to connect the oversupply of gas that we have in the south from Vaca Muerta with Buenos Aires, nor with Brazil, for example, that could be a major market for us. We don't have that. And how much does that cost? Around $1 billion. So, these are the contrasts. A lot of debt and too few productive investments. So we have to deal with that. And we will have to deal with the IMF and the IMF rules, which are, it's not easy. I'm looking forward and trying to see what the change in managing director of the IMF means to this. Because, we are coming from a managing director that was very much into public relations. And now we have to repay, and that is not public relations. You have to foot the bill. But in order to foot the bill, you have to grow, and you have to produce foreign exchange. So this is a challenge that is both for Argentina, but in particular, is a challenge for Kristalina Georgieva, that we know, we have not negotiated with her yet, but we know she's a professional, she's an economist, a very hands-on economist that likes to crunch numbers by herself. So this is something that is going to come. The government of Argentina is working very hard to really start the negotiations that, of course, are going to take place both with private bondholders, but in this case, the IMF is going to have a crucial role to play. It's not just the IMF, but it's the main lender to Argentina these days. And I'll take the other part, if you want, to elaborate on growth with the second question. Okay?
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you so much. And I think at the end of the day, what Argentina needs is breathing space, right? Mm-hmm. To have the chance to grow, to repay. Right. I've heard that Alberto has said very often that he wants to pay. He really wants to. Sure, of course. But he needs space.
All of us, all Argentines want to pay, but we need to grow.
Exactly.
And we want to produce the dollars that are needed to pay.
Especially on trade. So we will come back to you, Guillermo. Thank you so much. Let me go to Minister Paulo Guedes and ask you, dear Minister, you also have, well, not so new government, but you have a lot of challenges. And Brazil, which is one of the most powerful economies, país más grande do mundo, we need Brazil to grow. And I would like to ask you, Brazil has not been growing enough and has this tremendous challenge of reforms and the pensions particularly. So can you tell us a little bit, Minister, what are the things that this government of President Bolsonaro is trying to gear to get more investment, to open up, I hope, to seal the deal, Mercosur, Europe? There's so many things on your plate. Certainly. Different from Argentina, I must say, but also very challenging. Minister, please.
Well, Brazil was once, by some decades, the fastest growing economy in the world. Brazil used to grow faster than China, than Korea, than Japan. Japan was number 2 for 2, 3, 4 decades. Like Argentina was once the 5th largest, highest per capita income in the world. Somehow we lost our way. And in the Brazilian case, tracking just the last 40 years, you can see public expenditures as a ratio of GDP coming from 18% under the last 2 military governments, when 18% at the end of the military government was already 22, 23. Then the civilian governments, one after the other, 30%, 36, 40, 45%. So you saw not only a lot of misfunctionings, because when you're spending too much, for instance, in the Geisel government, which was the one before the last of the military government, he was recycling petrodollars and spending a lot through state companies. So our history of a sequence of exchange rate crises began there. Then the last military government with Figueiredo, it was the threat of hyperinflation. Inflation came from 30%, 40%, 100% to 200%. And then 2-3 years stable, if you could imagine something like that, stable around 200% inflation. All the economy indexed, wages, rents, everything indexed. Then the civilian government, first elections, and then we went to hyperinflation, 5,000%. And then we began fighting symptoms of inflation instead of fighting the underlying phenomena. We began attacking symptoms. We have frozen prices, then we froze financial assets. Then eventually we learned the importance of the central bank, of floating rates. But still, because public expenditures was uncontrollable, we just switched inflationary finance for a snowball indebtedness. Then internal debt came from 20-30% of GDP to almost 80% of GDP, which is where we are now. And then at the end of these 40 years, what we saw with this uncontrollable expansion of public spending, the corruption of a democratic system, and economic stagnation. So it is not something that happened suddenly to Brazil. Brazil was growing 7.3, 7.4 average for 2, 3, 4 decades. Then we decelerated to 5% at the end of military government. Then we began 2, 2.5 for 15, 20 years. And then we collapsed to 0 and eventually minus 3%, minus 3%. So it is a long story. I compared it to harpooned a whale, big whale, a giant dimension. It was a continent. It's a continental dimension economy with natural resources, with everything. And then we harpoon it with very high interest rates, with hyperinflation, with a lot of bureaucracy, high taxes. Eventually, you kill the whale. So we collapsed. And I'm using, just to simplify the situation, even to my president, to the popular opinion in Brazil, first year, we will remove 1 or 2 harpoons. It will grow 1%. Second year, we keep removing harpoons. It will move better, 2%. Third year, 3%. Last year, 4%. Well, first year was 1.2. And this year looks like it's 2.5. So even higher than what I thought at the beginning. So we're beginning to remove the harpoons. The economy is beginning to move. And we believe we will be contributing in this next 2, 3, 4 years, certainly to the growth of the region. We began attacking the number one expenditures, Social Security. It was exponential, the increase. And even worse, a factory of privileges, because they were unequal. If you are a public employee, not only you have stability of employment, not only you have higher wages, but you also have 6, 7, 8, 10 times more than the usual private sector retired man. So attacking this factory of privileges frontally put 1 million people in each capital of Brazil, of the Brazilian states. We have like 10, 12 states whose capitals have more than 1 million inhabitants. Rio de Janeiro is 10 million, São Paulo 15 million, Belo Horizonte is 3 million, Recife. So it's a continental dimension country with big cities. And then you saw 1 million people in each one of these capitals on the street asking for a social security reform on behalf of their children, of the future generations. I posed the problem. I said, listen, our lack of courage will destroy the retirement opportunities for everybody and will jeopardize our children. Either we face the problem now or the thing will derail. And then people went to the street asking for the Social Security, which was amazing. You see, even in countries like France today, they don't have political support to make the change. And in Brazil, everybody there. So the maturity of the thing is impressive. So the Congress approved the first reform. Then we attacked second largest expenditure. So not only the government was spending too much, 45% of GDP, but it was a low quality expenditures. Privileges in Social Security, one. Second one, interest payments on debt. One Marshall Plan a year, $106 billion to service debt a year, on internal debt. So it's the present value of a Marshall Plan. So Brazil rebuilds one Europe every year without escaping from poverty, which is mind-boggling. So it's a rich, wealthy country that can serve a debt like that and cannot remove. And when you compare the numbers, the first Bolsa Família, the voucher to poor people in Brazil, was 10 billion reais. We spent 40 times this, 400 billion reais, in the service of the debt. So it's shocking. So what did we do? Let's deleverage the public banks. Let's pay back the debt. Let's reduce or decelerate sharply the growth of indebtedness. Let's grab and control public expenditure, because if we do that, we change the mix. The mix was always easy on fiscal and tight on money with explosive interest rates. So we switched. Now it's tight on fiscal and easier money. Just from 1 year, last year, to this year, we reduced 100 billion reais the service of the debt. So it's 25% reduction in interest payments. So we attacked the Social Security, number one. We attacked the interest payments with good economic policy, number two. And now we attack the wage bill itself. In a country that grows 2-3%, 2.5% this year, and has inflation of 4%, revenues grow 4 plus 2.5 compounded, 7%, almost 8%. In 2 years, it's little less than 20% revenues going. So if you freeze wage bills for 1 year and a half or 2 years, vanish. Situation is controlled. So, and we are not doing that, the federal government. We are decentralized. We create the state of fiscal emergency. A mayor, a governor, or the president, whoever is in trouble, in fiscal trouble, has the power to freeze wages. It's the Brazilian version of the shutdown. In the US, the shutdown, you stop paying everything. We don't stop paying. We just don't give rises. You just don't give, you can't raise wages for 1 year and a half, 2 years. If you do that, revenues go up and you solve the problem with good economic policy again. So these are the three main
Major.
major expenditures control measures. Then we go to the other side. You talked about vaca muerta.
Can we come back to that in the second round, Minister,
Sure.
so we can give a chance to
Certainly.
Minister Marquez? But think about the following. I think the three things you mentioned are so important. There's one thing that both countries are facing, which is increasing poverty. Argentina, 30%. Brazil went from 18 to 20.5. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more how you feel about this and what you think should be done. Let me turn quickly to Graciela. And of course, Mexico is in the Cuarta Transformación, the fourth transformation, and that has created a lot of, I would say, uncertainties, certainties, questions, what's going to happen with the rules, with investment. Of course, there's a very good news, which is the trade agreement with the U.S., which was signed, which I think brings a lot of good perspectives. But indeed, Graciela, I think you have a lot of things to tell us about what Mexico is going to do. By the way, I think that Mexico has the lowest minimum salary of the world. And one of the first actions of President López Obrador was to increase the salary 36%, which was already good news, the lowest minimum salary of the world. So, Graciela, can you tell us a little bit how Mexico is going to cope with all these challenges, questions, a new transformation? The investors are asking questions, and so.
They are. Actually, thank you, Alicia. Investors are asking how is Mexico facing the challenges of this third decade of the 21st century. And one thing, it's clear, Mexico, it's committed to maintain stability, to maintain macroeconomic stability, which is key for resuming growth. So Mexico had sound public finances. We reached a primary surplus closing 2019. The inflation is controlled. We were within the range of the central bank. So inflation for 2019 was less than 3%. And we expect to follow that path. Public debt also had been increasing since 1913, 1914, and now we are paying back public debt so that it could not be a problem in the near future, and some of the public debt has been rescheduled. So in very good terms, actually. Beginning this year, we got one of the lowest interest rate ever for Mexican public debt. So the macro stability looks fine, and the completion of the USMCA is really a very good news for investors, for the Mexican government, because finally we have the rules. We have the rules for the commercial treaty in North America. We have very good perspectives on how these new rules could allow us not only to increase our integration into North America and make North America a very competitive region, but also would allow us to introduce a very strong industrial policy so that we can reach the regional content for certain sectors, particularly in the automotive sector. So these components, these macro components, are closely connected to a larger view of poverty and inequality. And as you mentioned, the minimum wage increased by 16% in nominal terms and in 13% in real terms, beginning in January 1st, 2019. And this year, the increase jumped to 20% in nominal terms, 17% in real terms. So there is a commitment for Mexico to offer to the world not low wages, but more productivity, to increase its participation in the global markets, not through low wages, but to better jobs, better paid jobs. But also, President López Obrador is not only interested in poverty, it's also interested in inequality. And income inequality is one, raising wages. It's a target, that kind of inequality, but we all are, as in many other countries in Latin America, we are a country of regional inequality, huge regional inequality. And for that, we needed different instruments. And so that's the emphasis of President López Obrador in developing the south and south part of the country. So by building huge infrastructure projects in the south that would allow to create jobs and to allow people to have better jobs. So by macroeconomic stability is not enough to alleviate poverty if you don't have a poverty alleviation program and an inequality reduction program. So we believe we have both, and we have very good perspectives, even though during the first year the growth rate was close to zero. We have very good expectations for this coming 2020 and the rest of the administration. We are not only betting on foreign investment, but also domestic investment. I think industrialists and foreign investors now see Mexico as a very good country in terms of rules, in terms of international rules, its engagement with the global economy, but also the strengthening of the domestic economy. The domestic economy that could create jobs, could increase income, and would guarantee social stability. The popularity of President Obrador tells that this is a government in which social unrest will not be present, at least in the coming years.
Thank you, Graciela. So we do have three very, I hope, the three countries will become the engine of growth of Latin America, which is so much slowing down, because 18 of the 20 economies are slowing down, with the exception of Colombia. So probably Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina can become the engine of growth, hopefully, and tackle poverty, because poverty in Mexico is also over 45%. Angel, you have been thinking a lot for many years and working a lot from your perspective, from your point of observation, on how the region, and you have been particularly interested in the region, and I thank OECD for that, and you in particular. How do you see things? How do you see this mix between inequality, discontent, the fiscal constraints, the debt challenges, the social unrest that is going all over the region? How is OECD looking at all these, and climate change, no question about it, that is already there. And by the way, these three countries have one thread in common, the three persons that are here, which is energy. IPF, Vaca Muerta, Preal, Pemex. So maybe in the last round you can tell us if energy can become an engine of growth, and what type of energy? Carbonized or decarbonized, or what? Angel.
Let me start with where you left off. That is growth of 0.1, 0.2, basically flat growth. And then an outlook of 1.2 or 1.3 for the region in next year. Maybe a little bit higher, 1.6 perhaps, something like that for the year after. Clearly insufficient for the needs, for the demographics of the country. What Pablo was telling us is that, the story is about 5 or 6% growth sustained over relatively long periods of time, with Argentina being one of the largest per capita in the world, and with Mexico again, maybe because of the commodities, maybe because of what, but you basically have now missing a crucial element, which is the question of growth in the region. And that puts a lot of pressure on the governments. It puts a lot of pressure on political leaders, on ministers, etc., because you need the growth in order to generate both the revenue as well as the opportunities, both in terms of fiscal revenue, but also in terms of the jobs that are not depending on the government. Now, the word productivity was mentioned many, many times. The productivity in Latin America is about 41% of the productivity in the European Union. Why? How did it happen? That
Over 27 of the U.S.
Yeah, 27% of the U.S. And I'm sorry, 41% is a good number.
Yes, it's a good number.
No. But then Pablo alluded to some of the attenuation mechanisms that we have used, like our public elements of support of the poverty, and then saying, well, we're paying so much debt service that we can hardly increase the size of our poverty-fighting ministries and then poverty-fighting mechanisms. And then what happened is that as the growth slowed down, so did the capacity to continue to promote inclusion and cohesion. So right now we are in a very difficult situation where we have to recover growth in order to be able to have the resources, in order to be able to fund the compensating, anything close to what you call automatic stabilizers. The closer we come to automatic stabilizers in Latin America are these kinds of mechanisms. So we have a problem. Now, the other problem is that which are one of the greatest enemies, informality, formalization, informality. In the case of Mexico, there has been progress. It went from 60 to 57%. So clearly, even there, you see a very small, relatively. Now, how do you create, for example, skills programs with 60% informality? How do you create, if 60% of the people are not creating the pension fund because they live day to day, mouth to mouth, etc. But also, there's no loyalty between the company and the employee because, it can break any time. The relationship can break any time. So I don't try a little bit harder for the company's sake, and the company does not try a little bit harder for my sake, and therefore, we just go our own separate ways. That is a very big issue. Women's participation in the labor market. There's a big labor participation gap, and there's also a pay gap, and there's also a skills gap, and then you also you have in the universities, even high school universities, the women are just as good, even better, and then they stop when they are childbearing age, and then they stop again when they have to deal with the elderly. So in a way that's so the question is, there's no surprise. The social discontent comes from the fact that we have for many decades, it's not about yesterday, it's not about, actually for 10 years during the crisis to start with, left too many people out. So the diagnosis has to be to get back these people into the action, to give them the opportunities, to give them the chance, to give them the skills, but to provide them skills. It's not just a question of providing them just money to buy the next meal, but also to give them the skills to fight their way into a very competitive, mostly now increasingly digitalized economy going forward, etc., especially in the cities, because we became urban before we became rich. And therefore, we have a lot of people in the cities, and that creates a problem. We have to deal with the urban-rural divide, but we have to create the question of the cities.
I'm going to have to stop you there.
So let me just go into two last words. One is the discontent is linked to the quality of the services, which are not good enough because we cannot finance them to be good enough, but also discontent is linked to corruption. Corruption is a terrible cancer. Corruption has been one of the reasons why only less than half of the people trust the governments, why it's dropping, it's falling, and why people perceive corruption everywhere, and why people are saying, why should I pay taxes if they're going to go to somebody's pocket? This is the most difficult part that we have to overcome. Get the confidence back, And I have to say, the very important examples of how you deal with the question of the confidence back. But that, I believe, today is probably the single most important challenge that we have.
Moral tributaria, moral fiscal. Okay.
And confidence,
And
confidence.
confidence.
On the
Now, listen, we don't have time, unfortunately, to bring the public, because I think we have to end at 3:15, isn't it? So I can give you only a couple of minutes to the panel, but let's take 2 questions, but if they are so short, and then we come back to the panel. Mariscal, come in.
Nicolas Mariscal from Mexico. I'm very happy to see Mexicans here, and this is great. Congratulations.
And women, huh?
And women, that's true.
Okay,
Thank
very
you so
good.
much.
Thank you.
One issue, very important, coming from my sector, the construction sector, which we generate a lot of work, and something is wrong all over Latin America. There has not been enough creation of jobs, and we needed also the participation of the private sector all over Latin America. My question is, to all the panels here, we need the participation. And the corruption issue. The World Economic Forum has something it's called the PACI, which means fighting against corruption. So that's one of the biggest issues. So I want to hear something related to the construction industry.
Thank you. One more here, and I have to give it to the woman, if I may. I know, you're Mexican too, I know. I know. But gender wins.
Hi, I'm Laís. I'm a global shaper from Brazil. So I'm kind of speaking here on behalf of youth. So I've heard a lot of talk here about past, strategy, future, but nobody here said nothing specifically about youth. So in a context of inequality as ours in Latin America, and with one hand we have no incentives on education for poor and middle classes to thrive. And on the other hand, we have educated young people fleeing from the country. We have actually a brain drain, not only the country, but the region. So, and in my perspective, I think that economy is not only about money and profit, but also about well-being and equity. So my question here is basically how and why to talk about future without considering and talking about youth, and why we're not putting science, arts, and culture as a priority.
Thank you. So let me go back to the panel, and let me start with you, Guillermo.
Okay.
If you have the answers to all these questions.
How much time
In
do
1
we
minute?
have? I do have.
Can you imagine?
I do have.
Oh, my God.
But let me,
There
let
will
me
be
get
other
back.
panels, of course,
Let
but-
me get back to where I left,
Yes.
because I left one question and answer from you.
Exactly.
And that's related to growth and to the future. So what is really the key, or what we perceive as the key to the future and to the future growth of Argentina? How can we contribute first to the people of Argentina in terms of growth, in terms of employment? And this goes also in terms of equality, gender, and all of the subjects that were taken in the last questions. Well, Argentina needs to increase exports. Exports are really trailing behind, and there are 3 main sectors for exports. One is the traditional one of Argentina, that is agriculture. Agriculture is and will continue to be an important sector for contributing in terms of exports. We have one that is the least one that is contributing, but one that has a tremendous potential, that is mining. You know, we have the Andes, as Chile has the Andes, as Peru has the Andes, but when you look at the contribution of mining in Argentina compared to Chile or compared to Peru, is almost non-existent in relative terms. So that is a possibility that we want to really move into. And the third is energy. I'm amazed by how Vaca Muerta, perhaps because of the name. The name is really
It's very
a
bad.
bit strange.
Yes.
So,
It's very
but
sad.
everybody knows here at the forum, everybody knows what Vaca Muerta more or less is. Well, Argentina's energy sector goes beyond Vaca Muerta. There's a lot of petroleum that is not necessarily, non-conventional drilling and fracking. So right now, about 19-20% of the petroleum that is consumed in Argentina comes from Vaca Muerta. Only 20%. 40% of the gas, of the natural gas, which is very important because about 56% of the energy matrix of Argentina is based on natural gas. So we are moving forward, and here to show how I want to really base and take advantage in order of shortening this presentation. So I'm going to be basing my next part of the presentation on what President Trump said this morning. Because President Trump is very interesting, I think it was a very interesting intervention. He was a keynote speaker, but I want to take in particular when he talked about energy. He talked about energy, he explained very well energy, how that's working not only in terms of the efficiency of the United States and geopolitics. Well, Argentina is part of the same type of geology as the United States is. Vaca Muerta is part of the same geology. So we finished drafting a new bill that is going to go shortly to Congress. I don't know if it's going to be in 10, 15 days or something like that. But really, what are we aiming at with this new regulatory environment? It's detaching, working in non-conventional, which is very capital intensive, very much factoring applied to petroleum, detaching Argentine risk from that, because that's the key. We need capital. In order to drill, in order to frack, in order to develop in its plenitude resources like Vaca Muerta and non-conventional resources, you need not just to have the rock. We do have the rock, but we need capital. So we are really aiming at attracting capital. So here they're telling me to stop, but this is the most important part I had to say.
Know.
But I know there are other sessions. But I will take that in the continuing sessions that we have. Thank you very much.
So don't miss the next session of Guillermo.
Don't miss the next chapter.
Exactly. Minister, I'm sorry I have to cut you so much, so I'm only going to allow the countries.
We should connect Vaca Muerta to our distribution. We want the oil from pre-salt and natural gas from pre-salt. We have the cleanest energy matrix in the world. It's Brazilian.
Yeah.
Because of the hydroelectric power.
Absolutely.
And we could since we discovered a new frontier of oil, we need natural gas because it's halfway between the dirty of the oil and the clean, which is the hydroelectric. So we'll be using that. We broke 2 monopolies in exploration and distribution of gas. We think we'll reduce 40% the cost of energy in Brazil. We shall try to connect to Vaca Muerta. We're bringing natural gas from Bolivia and oil, and we'll get it from the pre-salt. So with this, we could reindustrialize the country. We also promoted the law of economic freedom, because in the US, everything is permitted, is allowed, except what's forbidden. In Brazil, everything is forbidden, except what is allowed. So that's the way corruption spreads. The highest the degree of control of the government over the resource, the highest the corruption. Power corrupts, absolute powers corrupts absolutely. So this thing of decentralizing resources, financial resource, and political power is in the agenda. As respect to the inequality and the youth, our social security reform presented there was all about the youth, all about the young guys. So we want to transit to a new world, eliminating totally the most cruel tax in the world, which is taxing labor. So the kid just getting out of school, 100% taxes on wages. So it's a low wage for whoever receives and very expensive for the company because there's no experience. So we want to remove taxes entirely for the youth so that they would have good jobs, good employments immediately as soon as they get out of school, and they would have a capitalization system for the future through the Social Security. Unfortunately, it did not pass. It had fiscal potence, but it could not transform the system. And finally, to the young people and also income inequality, we know that countries that have education even without natural resources. Japan does not have our oil, does not have our beautiful agricultural land. They have only Japanese, and every time one is born, the other falls in water, because it's a tiny country. But they have technology, they have education. South Korea, education. So we need to invest in education. And the earliest, the better. So we'll be supporting a massive first early stage resources, voucher, to help to educate kids the early stages. So, because most of the income inequality in Brazil come from two sources. First, the inequality of educational opportunities. So the poor kids don't have jobs, they don't have education, don't speak English, don't have, it's a very sad thing, and very high taxes on labor. And this tax on labor make that 40 million Brazilians do not contribute. They don't have jobs, they cannot contribute to the Social Security either. So you destroy jobs and you destroy the financial foundations of the Social Security system. We addressed that too. And the income inequality, one source, like I said, is the inequality of opportunity, especially through education, but also the privileges, that the lack of competition, because we should ask ourselves how 3.7 billion Eurasians are being removed from poverty. Never in the history of humankind so many people escaped from poverty, like India, China, Vietnam. They're escaping from poverty using the very same tools that we are not using: markets, competition. You go to Brazil, 200 million people have to buy construction services from 6 companies. Have to have banking service from 6 banks. So cartel here, cartel there, cartel everywhere, exploiting 200 million, because we don't like capitalism. We hate competition.
Thank you so much.
So think of that.
Let me give the last word to Graciela, very short, please,
last word. I
because
couldn't agree more.
at least to say goodbye, because
Goodbye. I couldn't agree more that corruption is very important for reducing poverty and inequality, and that's in the core of the program of the administration, the current administration.
The mandate he got too.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to push everybody. It was so interesting. Thank you, thank you, thank you.